Welcome to Nutrition Counselling Unscripted. I'm Carol. I'm here on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation, and I go by the pronouns she and her. And I'm here today with Cath.
Hi, Cath Morley. I'm here in Mi'kma'ki, which is today known more commonly as Nova Scotia, the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq, to which we are indebted and grateful. And I use the pronouns she and they. Today, Carol, we're going to talk about food as it pertains to nutrition counseling. That's a really big topic, food, but we will explain as we go along. And before we begin that, we want to reiterate what we've said in earlier recordings of how grateful we are for feedback. We welcome your feedback, of course, and we would love to hear from people who are listening. Gosh, who are you? Where are you? Because we don't have really a way to track that, and that's kind of would be interesting for us to learn. We know that a quarter to a third of our audience is not within Canada, which is a surprise to us. So that's pretty great. And we also would love to know, what do listeners want us to talk about, if anything? What would you love us to take a crack at, if you will? We've got our own list of things we'd like to cover. However, we really want to make our podcast efforts something of usefulness to listeners. So please do get in touch with us, either in the comments on YouTube or Spotify, or send us an email to ceeandcnutrition@gmail.com. That's cncnutrition@gmail.com. So Carol, food.
Food, yes. What a big topic.
We were thinking, I think, when we did some prep for this recording, about how dietitians can use food and food preparation as one of their tools in nutrition counseling.
Yeah, definitely. You and I were chatting about this idea of how food actually got taken out of nutrition counseling,
Right.
and knowing how important food is in relationships and in building, and how it can really be used to really build some rapport with clients, be able to really give them some valuable tools that actually apply to their everyday life.
Yeah.
To know how to prepare food, or different types of food.
Dare I say, Carol, what is food?
What is food? Exactly.
It comes from plants, it comes from animals, and it comes from synthetics, right? That's
Right.
it. That's all there is. But a lot of folks don't know that. I remember asking my nephew when he's now 50, but when he was a little boy, preschool, where do peas come from? Did he know? When he opened the freezer and pointed at the bag. Like that, he had no idea that peas were a seed, actually. The other thing that you touched on there, and that I think it was our original thought for this, was how did food get taken out of dietetics, which we can certainly talk about. But you've shared with me some fascinating things that you've done with regard to bringing food preparation in group work that you've done, and other people that we know who've done some fascinating work. So we wanted to talk about that, with the end goal of inviting dietitians and dietetic students to think about how they might bring food into their practice, knowing that we all encounter challenges of infrastructure and, do you even have a place to do that? But even without a place, a physical space, a physical kitchen, there are ways to work around that. So where should we start at? With a bit of history, or?
Yeah, let's start with some history.
Some history.
That's always a good place.
So, Carol, how did food get taken out of dietetics?
Well, it's very interesting, because as you and I talked about it, the field of dietetics being female-dominated, we know that I always think about the field of dietetics, how it actually evolved, and a lot of it evolved, like especially my degree, evolved from home economy. And so even though my degree isn't actually called the degree of home economics anymore, it was still, our faculty said home economics on it, the building that I did my work in.
Yeah.
And I think part of what ended up happening was it wasn't seen as valid, right? It was seen sort of as women's work and not valid. So in order to become valid, that we really needed science.
And that speaks to capitalism, and it speaks to colonialism.
Yeah.
That women's work, as defined by white settlers from Northern Europe, was considered, you use the word valid, I would also add not valuable,
yes.
Which is, in my everyday thinking, I go, how dumb is that really, when you consider how often humans need to eat in order to survive? And how did it become so devalued?
Exactly. I remember when I got my degree, and a friend, air quotes here, would say to me, and it's like, well, what do you have a degree in? And I said, well, it's actually in human ecology, which is, home economics. Oh, I did that in high school. Why do you need a whole degree of it? And it's like, I think that's where we really started to see a shift in, we need to talk about something that is science-based so that we can compete
Yeah.
with other degrees, so that it was actually seen as something that not everybody knew. That's where looking at what is food actually made of. So let's not talk about bread. Let's talk about those little nutrients within the bread. Let's talk about riboflavin. Let's talk about thiamine, and what the body actually needs. So really break it more down into the nutrients of it.
You mentioned something about women's work. Gee, Carol, she says, or they say, tongue in cheek, do you think this had anything to do with sexism?
I really don't know, because I even think about our profession now.
Okay, wait a second. I also have to tell our listeners that we're both laughing. That was a rhetorical question, if anybody's wondering. Of course, it had everything to do with sexism. Carol and I are nodding vigorously. And what did you say about our profession today?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm very happy for the men and for their identified genders that are in our profession, but it is still the very minority.
Yeah, dominated by cis females.
Yes.
Changing every day, and that is the best, most wonderful thing that can happen when we welcome all kinds of people of all genders, of all sexualities to become dietitians. We need you. We need you.
We need diversity.
We need diversity. Oh my goodness. And I think, when I look at graduating classes at different universities in Canada, depending on where they're located, I see diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity happening. And I'm just so excited about that, because that's what we, and to celebrate that and really embrace, I already said it, to embrace that what that offers to us as a profession, to bring in all kinds of ways of knowing about food in particular, about how different cultures around the world think of the body, think of gender, think of age, think of, well, gosh, everything about, menstruation, menopause, everything, and bring that into our practice. And I think that you and I've talked a lot. Carol and I talked a lot about colonization. We're both taking a program right now through Wilfrid Laurier University on decolonizing in trauma care. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Carol?
Yeah.
It's fantastic, and if you're interested in exploring that further, I highly recommend you have a look at Wilfrid Laurier's programs and what they are offering. And no, we do not get paid by them. We just really love their work, is what that's all about. So we have to recognize, Carol, back to food colonization. We have to recognize sexism, classism. There was a time prior to the time I went to university in the 70s where, the universities were opened up in the 70s to people from working class backgrounds, which, of course, people had been there from working class backgrounds, but not in the numbers that came after. So there was definitely a classist element, or not element, well, it was way more than an element, dominance of people who came from moneyed families being the ones to get university degrees, and that's changed for the better, I think.
Definitely.
Or you and I, my friend, would not be sitting here today.
No. So we do need to send a huge thank you to the people that have come before us.
We certainly
do. And really paved the way and are continuing to.
Yes. And I want to assure anybody who's a recent grad or a student that these conversations in dietetics education continue. How do we work to make dietetics education more accessible to people? We know it's expensive. We know we're asking a lot of people to, certainly where I work at university here, which is in a rural location, people have to have cars. Well, and that means they have to have a driver's license, and not everybody has that. Not even capacity. They don't have it within their families to make that happen, and especially those students who, like me, I don't know about you, pay for everything themselves because their families were not supporting their post-secondary education. So, golly, there are some incredible students out there who are making things work despite a whole lot of barriers, and hats off to them. I'm really proud of them. To let you all know, we do continue to talk about this. We're trying to figure out ways to not make dietetics the domain of the people who come from families with money
Exactly.
across the board.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, as to bring it back to what we were talking about, this fact that the history of why we're sitting where we're sitting today, and that idea that a lot of times dietitians aren't actually talking about food in nutrition counseling.
So that gets to another topic that we're not going to talk about today, but we'll touch on ever so briefly, and we'll come up and we'll talk about it in a future episode, which is the fear that we've heard from dietitians that if they don't give a handout and if they don't talk about nutrients, somehow they're going to get in trouble.
Yeah. But I was even thinking about the fact that so many times of sitting in session that I'm not actually talking about the actual food, I'm talking about the nutrient, right? Yeah. And more about the only way food came into session for me initially. Like I'm thinking like, okay, we're going back quite
when you say session,
few years.
What do you mean session?
Counseling, when I did one-on-one work with people.
Counseling one-on-one, yeah.
Yeah. And the piece that I would only talk about food as it related to whatever nutrient it was. Oh. So that I could prove that it's okay. I do know stuff. I do know, this. I have this degree. I went to school for 4 years. I know things. And yet, that's not what people necessarily was helpful to them.
No.
Definitely it was helpful for a client I was seeing who had osteoporosis going, okay, I need to increase my calcium. What foods have calcium? Great. Or, and I'd always do my whole, the bioavailability of calcium, and you need to have it with vitamin D, and you need to do this. And it's like, okay, did they really care about any of that? Likely not.
Excellent question, Carol. I think that leads us to another point. How do we know what difference we're making? How do we assess outcomes and so on? And if we stick with the counting the numbers of how many handouts did I give out or how many sessions did I conduct, we miss the point.
Exactly.
Absolutely, right? And so trying to figure out about what is it that people are coming to us for, and which we talked about in episodes 1 and 2 about fear nuggets, about why this, why now, trying to figure out what's that person doing there and how can I help?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think about, as I was saying, I could share all this information with a person and I could give them a list of foods that had calcium in them, for example. Well, and then when I started asking questions, I started realizing how many people were coming to me and didn't know how to cook.
Okay.
And that is where food started becoming more of a priority in the time that I spend in groups with people or with those one-on-one times, is understanding what people knew about food, what their comfort was with preparing food. And then, as we were talking about diversity, of what foods were acceptable to them.
So Carol, before we get into food, no, that's what we said we'd talk about. But I think it's really important to highlight what you just said, that you thought you knew what you were doing. You learn that people don't know how to prepare food. And so then I'm watching your face as I say this to see how you process this, or is that you had to reckon, okay, I had my agenda, but now I'm finding out about something about their lives that I hadn't reckoned with before. So it's up to me to make the change in how I'm going to approach this kind of work. Would that be accurate?
That's definitely. It was really me putting away the privilege that I had of growing up in a household where my mom cooked. And I saw that every day. And from a young age, was very involved with it. And recognizing that not everybody grew up in that environment, or I spent a good portion of my career working in mental health. And unfortunately, may not even have access to a kitchen because of living conditions. And so it really humbled me to be able to take a step back and say, okay, how can I help people meet their nutritional concerns that they came in to see me about?
Recognizing that they don't know how to cook. So all of your really great information is going to fill the space with noise for a while, and then people will go home being no better equipped than when they started.
Exactly. And it's not even,
right?
Yeah. And it's not even just not even being able to cook. They may not have access to the food due to financial, right?
Right.
And here it is. I've got my beautiful handout, and those might not be foods that are affordable or are culturally appropriate.
And then there's a huge, long, wonderful culture around the world of people harvesting from the land and the water. I'm really happy to see that make its way into resources and things that we might call upon in our work, to see that, yeah, people do grow food. People do go out on the land and harvest berries. And I'm not everyday folk right here where I live in rural Nova Scotia who know exactly where all the blackberry bushes are and where the apple trees, that randomly grew because somebody threw an apple core out of their car, and harvesting that. Like, you're laughing at me, but that's true. I heard of somebody on the CBC radio, and she was talking about that's her fall hobby. She knows where all those places are, defunct orchards and stuff. And so people provisioning that way through harvesting what freely is available, right? I think it's fabulous, and I'd like to get more into doing that myself. Yeah, so people not having access to food, not having access to funds to buy food, or if there are food outlets where they live, they're fast food or little convenience stores and so on. Heard that a lot from students who come from Newfoundland, where they had only one grocery store in their community that's now gone, and then what they're left with, the elders in the community are left with a convenience store where they can buy processed cheese and bologna and marshmallows. Not a lot of choice.
No.
So all of that needs to be figured in when we're working with people. So you were telling me some of the things you've done, a session or a program that you offered called Crock Pot Cooking with Carol.
It was one of those interesting things, and I can't even remember how it kind of came about. In the work that I do, we work with all populations. And so I believe that I had some younger university age in their 20s who were busy working, had difficulty preparing meals. And so one of the things that I absolutely love is my slow cooker. So I was like, well, do you have a slow cooker? And they're like, well, yeah, my mom gave me one, but I don't know what to do with it. It was that idea that came, okay, well, let's do a group. And so I had them come in, and I called it Crock Pot Cooking with Carol, just because I thought that sounded cool, and had them come in, and we talked about how to use our slow cookers. What can you do with them? How do you modify a recipe that you really like so that you can actually do it in your slow cooker? And again, this was done for this particular group of, it happened to be ladies. And down the hall, I work in a building where there's other programs that run. There was a senior women's group that saw my little sign. And of course, said to the woman leading to the group, was like, can we skip our group and go to that today? So it was just kind of caught on because so many people might have different equipment or hear that, oh, this is a wonderful thing, and they get it and then don't know what to do with it.
So Carol, how did you do that? Like, did you set up, here's what you put into your crock pot? Like sort of that, the magic of television TV shows where they already have a dish made and then they put it in the oven and then seconds later they take it out. It's already been made. How did you do it?
No, I wasn't that inventive. Basically, it was more of a discussion. I of course brought in my crock pot. I will admit I have several crock pots because different sizes, different needs, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Able to bring them in and just sort of talk about how much do you need to fill up? What foods are, or like when we talk about food safety, right?
Yes.
Things that you need to be mindful of.
Yes.
In order to get better production, how full do I need? How much liquid do I need in my crock pot? Talking about what happens if the recipe calls for pasta. When do I add that? Why do I not take the lid off my crock pot while it's cooking? As much as I'm really, really tempted to do it. So that was more what I did in that particular group. I have had clients on a one-on-one basis come in. I'm very lucky where I work. We actually have what we call a therapeutic kitchen. So we can have clients come in, and it's like set up like a home kitchen. We have a dining room table, so we can do meal support. We also have a stove, an oven, and different equipment in there. So we can actually cook with our clients if they're not sure how to cook or they are living alone. We had some university students that were living on their own and were having difficulty making meals. So they came in and they did like a community kitchen so that they cooked together, and then each of them took home meals for the week.
Oh, wow.
So then they actually had dinners, and there were foods that they actually really liked, but they're living away from home, weren't able to do it. So we were able to offer that kind of a service. And as I was saying, so I've had a person come in with their crock pot from home. They weren't sure how to use it. So they came in the morning, and we prepped everything that needed to go into it.
Yeah.
We put it on the counter and we plugged it in. And then she came back at the end of the day.
Wow.
And we finished off the dish that she needed. So that then she had food to feed her family. So
you talked about a therapeutic kitchen. What does that look like? What is that?
In our building, what we really wanted was we didn't want something to look industrial. We really wanted something so that when the people we work with come in, they felt comfortable eating. We know that eating can be really difficult for some people. And so if you come into a place that is very institutionalized, it can increase that stress. So our therapeutic kitchen would be just like walking into a very beautiful kitchen in somebody's home. We've got it completely done up. So we have all the dishes, we have pots and pans, we have bowls. We tried really hard to have all the equipment on hand that we would need. We have cupboards stocked with sort of those essentials, right? We talk about the basic shelf as dietitians. So we do have the spices, the herbs, and that are all there. So if a client is going to come in and cook with us, we're just basically bringing in any of those perishable foods that they need. I'm also very lucky that I work in a program where we've been able to cover the cost of it for the most part.
So, Carol, that raises a number of points. One is, how does this get funded? And I think what's really important to say is you don't need to have the beautiful space that Carol just described. But when you were describing that, it reminded me of when my brother was in hospice and the beautiful space they had there to encourage families to eat together. A beautiful dining room suite and a kitchen where people could retherm things they brought from home. And really, really, when you were describing that, I went, that's why they did that, because it's a tough time. It's a tough time when you have a loved one in hospice and there are so many people around. So being able to offer them food is pretty fab. So to me, this is just sparking all these ideas of where dietitians could get involved. The other thing that I wanted to mention was you were mentioning that your funding comes from different departments or ministries or what have you. So something that I was not trained how to do, but of course I've learned how to do over the course of my career, and I encourage dietitians who perhaps newer to practice. Oh, I shouldn't even say that. That's making a big assumption. It could be anybody. But how do you write proposals for these kinds of things? How do you advocate for what you know is a tool that will help you do your job? You know, it would be like a physio not having a gym space.
Exactly. And I think we're very lucky because as the team that I work on, we recognized in the building that we had been in previously, this was an area that we were really lacking in even trying to support clients to eat. Yeah. When you're going into a room that is got like almost like a conference room, right?
Yeah.
It's not the right environment. So we felt that this was a priority for us, and we went forward, and luckily management was very supportive of it.
That's wonderful.
And I think that's the piece, is finding those allies that can see how valuable this is for the people that you're working with.
That's really important. And Carol, these days, there's a really lovely literature around food and culinary as it relates to dietetic practice that didn't exist even 10 years ago. So lots to draw on if you're thinking, I'd like to advocate for that kind of space, which brings me to my next point, Carol. As you were mentioning me, while it's beautiful, the drawers don't hold cutlery dividers.
No, it unfortunately, it was designed for looks and not actually our input. You know, so there's a lot of wasted space in it, but it works really well. I mean, nice. So I always give, people the preamble of, yes, this is our cutlery drawer. There's a reason why we don't have it nicely laid out, and it's the cutlery is just in the drawer. Yeah. But it's all clean, it's all sanitized. I mean, we're lucky. Health unit comes in and inspects it every year. Beautiful. So we can actually do that.
This reminds me of point number 2 regarding advocacy. Be one of the people involved in kitchen design.
Yes.
When I was doing some research work in the UK, I attended a session in London that was entitled Designing Kitchens as Though Women Mattered. And I loved it because what they talked about is historically how the Victorian kitchen, let's say, how was it set up? Very different from what we have come to know as the triangle in kitchen design. They had a working hexagon, actually. That was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But this phenomena that designers and architects, kitchen designers, designing things for looks and not for functionality. So if you have the opportunity to be involved in the design of these things, I'm sounding like your grumpy old auntie here. Grab it. Do something with that opportunity, because we want these spaces to live on and be useful to people long after we have stopped working there. That's where you have a designated space. And some of the things we talked about is, what if you don't?
Exactly.
And so a couple of thoughts come to mind. for me. One is making use of existing spaces. So you mentioned a classroom, and I know of some dietitians who work a lot with people who have difficulty with texture, with you have to be able to chew and swallow, people who cannot do that. And so working with families on texture modification and how the tolerance of one texture might work now for their loved one, but it changes over time. So how do you modify textures as their condition progresses? So what they did is they used a blender and they used a food processor in a classroom setting. And it wasn't like a kitchen where you have water supply and all that sort of thing, but they had all of the foods that were prepared in the institution kitchen brought up to a classroom to demonstrate to families. So it was a food demo. It wasn't we're not going to eat this necessarily. Well, sure could. Issues that you just also mentioned of food safety. When you're dealing with a more liquidy food, a puree, the risk of food safety is the surface area is huge. So did you hear me say huge? So food safety, especially in immunocompromised loved ones that people are taking care of. I thought that was brilliant to make use of the space that you have.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and the other thought I had was because I work at a university right now, we have a beautiful kitchen. It just was renovated from 1963 to 2019. It's now new, it's beautiful, and it is available to community groups. So look about you and see there are places of worship, there are schools, there are universities. Where else would there be, Carol?
I'm even thinking, like, I'm not sure what their pieces, but like here we have the Boys and Girls Club.
Yes, do they have a kitchen?
Community centers?
Yeah.
Yeah, Boys and Girls Club here. They do a beautiful job of cooking with the kids.
Nice.
Yeah. And getting them involved. And they actually, during COVID, they did beautiful online videos. Let the kids know this is what you need and get them cooking. So I think, you've got different community centers, right?
Yeah.
That you more than likely could probably access.
Yes, for sure. And I'm just thinking, I'm smiling because I'm thinking of two places I have been in. One was a bookshop that used to have a cafe as part of it, and or maybe did have a cafe, like a coffee suite kind of array. But they also had not even behind the scenes, just they didn't use it anymore, but they had a full kitchen set up there. So once upon a time, it had been a cafe with a full menu. Would a bookstore like that like you to make use of their space? Oh, I think so. Right? It was right there in the downtown area of this small town. That was really nice. And then I also noticed there's this really lovely little bath and bed not far from where I live here in rural Nova Scotia. And they have a full kitchen there, but it's right now set up as like their painting center, but it was never originally designed for that. It was to show people how to use equipment that they wanted to buy in their shop. Right now, I'm just thinking last time I was in there, it's got paint and stuff like that. But so that gets put away in bins and boxes, and the kitchen space is still there. So would a enterprising person with a small retail outlet want to have some kind of group come in for some kind of learning related to cooking? Oh, I think so.
Definitely.
Right?
I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to partner with people in the community.
I agree. Yeah.
Because it serves both of us.
Yeah, so you've gone the route of submitting a proposal, having the space purpose built for your group, and there are lots of opportunities in communities for people to there are lots of spaces, like look about you when you're shopping, don't go out there doing your stuff. Oh, and also at the grocery stores they have beautiful kitchen spaces. Have you noticed that?
Oh yeah, some
like incredible.
Well, not so much here, but we know that some larger cities or some smaller towns have that, right?
Our superstores and our Sobeys here in Atlantic Canada, they all have beautiful kitchen spaces for the community.
That's wonderful.
They employ chefs too, which, and some of them employ dietitians. Excellent.
Yes.
But I think, approaching those dietitians and saying, I've got this group over here. How can we come to your store and make use of your space? I think it's all possible.
I think so too. And I love when you mentioned about grocery stores, because I think some people that I work with who aren't comfortable going to the grocery store to even go buy the food, right? Mm-hmm. Where I've actually met them so that, we can help pick out or help them understand what it was that we needed for that cooking that day, right?
Yeah.
And then meeting up with them at the next space, or at the space that we were going to cook in.
Carol, I'm going to do a tiny diversion here just for a second. It's not really a diversion because it's all about food. What do you think about food models? I have a real aversion to them. I would prefer real food or photos of real food.
Yeah. I have food models
Yeah.
that I use with clients, and what I like to use them for is I like to put it in my hand and say, compared to this, how much did you have?
Oh, I
I
see.
find that they're really helpful, especially when I'm doing stuff on video conference, because again, this is my hand, sort of compared to that. I also, a group that I just finished running in the spring, when we were talking about getting an idea around a portion, I brought in the stuff from home, right? A deck of cards, a deck, just to get more of that rough idea. So I don't use food models near as much as I used to.
Yeah. That would be true with me too. They were and still are widely available. There are huge catalogs of them. I'm sure many of our listeners know all about that. I think that sometimes I think people find them kind of fun to play with. Like going like, this is so weird for, whatever, broccoli, let's say, right? This is weird. This texture of this broccoli is very weird. But happen to have, what is that? Mashed potatoes?
This is my spaghetti.
Oh, that's spaghetti. There you go.
So I find sometimes when I'm doing groups, though, it can be really helpful because now again, COVID, but you can't pass them around, but it really helped people engage more, right?
Yeah.
Being able to say, oh, look at that.
So that's if carbohydrates become important to people for whatever reason.
But it's a nice jumping off point sometimes, right?
Yeah,
and then sometimes when, depending what you have for food models, if I've got some different foods, then it brings those conversations to other foods. So I don't like pasta. Okay, well, let's talk about what else is there.
Yeah.
What do you like? How do we modify so that you can get different nutrients and you can get, some carbohydrates and that.
So, Carol, that runs the whole gamut from low protein, low carb, high carb, like everything, right?
Yeah.
You could use those kinds of things. All right, so we're going to move to wrapping up here. One of the things that I'm hearing through our conversation that I'm curious about your thoughts are, we just talked about food models, we just talked about food as a possibility to use when working with people in a nutrition counseling setting. Neither of us were taught that when we went to school. Nobody mentioned, in fact, food was really poo-pooed when I went to school, learned about it. So what I'm thinking about is how everything we've talked about, not just this episode, but all of them, speaks to a dietitian finding their own way that they're going to practice that feels right for them.
Food was not emphasized, right, when I did my schooling. And I think about the one thing that I'm always encouraging people to do is eat, and to eat regularly. And I actually encourage clients to bring their snacks with them into my actual office. Because you know what? Many times I think people are coming to see me on their lunch hour, or they're rushing out right after work. They're not getting home to get their dinner. And to me, it's like, it does not make sense for me to say to somebody, okay, I want you to eat regularly, but I'm going to set up my appointment times when it's going to interfere with your eating. So being able to have a little table beside the chair in my office, it gives them a place to be able to put down, whatever it is that they bring for a snack.
Yeah.
And making it known and making it sort of normalized.
Yeah, I say that all the time to students that somehow feel like they're not allowed to eat in class. They can, because other professors tell them not to. But I really want, I work with for the most part, young people who are growing, who are hungry all the time. And
who are using their brains, and that brain just needs that energy.
Yeah, so please bring your snacks and don't feel shy about eating them. I'm never going to get mad at you for nourishing your body in class. So I love that message, right? I'm never going to get mad at you for feeding yourself. Right?
No, and it's actually clients get praised, sort of. It's like, good, I'm so glad that you're having something, because I know that if you're nourished as we're having these conversations, you're going to remember more.
And let's also remember, not everybody that we work with eats. So we're mentioning those people who actually can
eat.
Yeah. Okay, Carol, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. We thought that we would talk about next time being authentic and going off script and feeling okay with it. It's something that we've talked a lot about in the gather round groups that we hosted earlier in 2021.
Yeah.
And I mentioned it right at the very beginning of this recording, and we'll wrap up with it, is this idea of getting in trouble if you do things a little different than how you were taught. A-okay, that is. I mean, not if they're harmful to people, you know what I mean?
Right.
I remember I told you, Carol, about this person who told us in our writing group about being trained by a so-called, quote, diet doctor, end quote, run, be scared if anybody calls themselves that, to think of themselves as pigs at a trough so that they would develop a revulsion to eating. Okay, we're not talking about that, Carol.
No. No.
I'm looking at your face and you're going, she's making a scrunchy face. No,
Yeah.
we're not talking about that. Where we're not bringing to folks.
We're not bringing harm, but we're bringing ourselves.
Our authentic
to
selves.
ourselves.
And that's what we are we're really excited to be talking about that. So, Carol, thank you for today, for the chat.
Yes.
Thank you to our listeners. Please, as I said right off the top, submit us comments and ideas of what you'd like to hear us talk about. Got any thoughts about this idea of bringing your authentic self to your work? We'd love to hear, we'd love to read what you have to say. We want to make these podcasts useful to our listeners so that they can imagine their way to offering nutrition counseling in a way that they feel really great about.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye-bye. Talk to you later.
Bye.